Rye is notoriously difficult to work with on a home distilling scale, so I decided to make some and find out, is it really a gooey, slimy, icky, absolute pain in the ass, or not? How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse and this is Stiiiillllll. Today we're making a rye whiskey. So for those of you that don't know, rye has a tendency to put a whole lot of beta-glucans into the mash. And if you're doing that at say 5%, like some beers will use or some bourbons will use, you're probably not going to notice it that much. But if you start pushing that percentage higher, maybe 15, 20 plus %, you're going to start to notice things getting thick and slimy and gummy. It's a hard texture to describe, but it's almost like a sauce that's been thickened with cornstarch. Kind of like a sweet and sour sauce or a teriyaki sauce, something like that. So all of that gumminess can cause problems with the brewing process. If you're using a false bottom, it can cause stuck sparges. Not fun. If you're using a brew in a bag setup, it can just be kind of inefficient. Not to mention that the whole process, the logistics of transferring and handling the stuff is just more a pain in the ass. It's harder to deal with gel than it is with liquid. That's kind of what we're dealing with. Now there are ways to combat this gumminess, but today I decided to just do a standard mash to see exactly how bad it is. Now, spoiler alert, at the end of this video you will be seeing me taste this whiskey that I've made. And with the help of the tastiest coffee liqueur I have ever tasted, and today's sponsor, Mr. Black, thank you Mr. Black, we'll also be finding out if the rye whiskey I make can stand up to a coffee old-fashioned cocktail. More from Mr. Black cold brew coffee liqueur and tasting notes at the end of the video. But for now, let's get stuck in to the grist, our grainy ingredients. Today, we're going to use 25 kilograms of grain, no sugar, so it's going to be all grain, and roughly 75 liters of water to make our mash. Total volume, I'm going to let it fall where it may. If I need a little bit more water, so be it. I'm not too stressed about it. I have a big enough fermenter to fit plenty into. So, first up, rye. The star of the show. The reason we're making this video, 60% of the grist is going to be rye, which is going to come to 15 kilograms. Freedom units, guys. It's going to be up here. The rye we're using today is in fact all malted. Why am I using malted rye? Because that's what I could get my hands on at a reasonable price without having to pay exorbitant hippie health food store prices. Yes, most malted rye does in fact have some diastatic power. The stuff that I am using has roughly enough to convert itself, but not a whole lot more. Next up we have the corn, and actually, funnily enough, the corn that I'm using today is malted as well. Simply because I have it, I wanted to use it. It's not going to make a huge difference in a recipe like this. Heads up guys, malted corn has a DP of zip, zero, nada, nothing, or very, very close to it. So you can't rely on it to even convert itself. This recipe is calling for 24% corn or 6 kilos. And lastly, we have malted barley at 16% or 4 kilos. And obviously the DP, the diastatic power on this stuff is huge, off the charts compared to everything else. It's going to do the heavy lifting in terms of converting the corn and also maybe help the rye out a little bit if it's a touch subpar on its diastatic power. Like I say in all of these videos, you need to make sure the grain is crushed or milled before we go mashing it, because otherwise you're going to have an absolute horrible efficiency in your mash. Now you can do this at home with some relatively cheap equipment like my little malt muncher here. Just be aware guys, standard corn, whole corn is not going to go through something like this. Crushed corn you can kind of get away with. Malted corn you can kind of get away with. Or, of course, you can pay the homebrew store to do it for you. By the way, shout out to brewshop.com who, when I ordered this stuff, noticed that my order was obviously wrong. They called me, we figured it out, it was here the next day. You're awesome. Thanks, guys. Anyway, now it is time to mash in. And like I said earlier on, one of the big problems with rye is stuck sparges. I'll be real, we're just going to completely ignore it and skip that step. So, today I'm going to be mashing in the fermenter. And to do that, you're going to need 75 liters of water at strike temperature. I've worked it out for me in my situation to be 70 degrees Celsius. Obviously for you, that may be different. Use a strike water calculator to make sure. Start adding in your milled grain a little bit at a time. Add some in, give it a good stir, add some more in until you're all done. The thermal mass of the grain sitting at ambient room temperature is going to pull the temperature of your wash down, and today we're aiming for 65 degrees Celsius. Now, if you're somewhere between 64 and 66, do absolutely nothing. If you're somewhere between 63 and 67, it's your call. You can leave it if you want. I'd probably suggest starting to adjust it a little bit at that point in time. And if you're outside of that range, definitely adjust it. In this situation, the easiest way to do that is with some extra very cold water or some extra boiling water. Give it one last really good stir, cover it up and forget about it for an hour. Pop the top, give it another good stir, cover it up again and leave it for another 45 minutes. And then it's time to start getting this thing to cool down, ready to pitch our yeast. Okay, actually guys, let's just hold up for a second and talk about why you would want to put rye in whiskey in the first place. Does it actually give a different flavor than, like just a bourbon, for example? And the answer is, hell yes it does, definitely. But the thing is, the standard explanation of what it does is just, it's spicy, which I find lame. Maybe sometimes you'll get earthy and spicy. Also kind of lame. So I have pulled on my memory of every rye I've ever tasted. And of course, I thought it would be smart to do some homework. And I've put together a little list of what I think rye might contribute to a whiskey on any given day. First of all, an earthiness, somewhere between dusty grain and like potting mix, like sweet potting mix. 2, spicy, I'll give it to you, but a little bit more detail. For me, it's a lot more cooking spice. It's not habanero, it's not chili, it's not pepper, it's more cooking spice, specifically cloves, and there's a mouthfeel that comes along with it. You know that slightly numbing anesthetic sort of property that you get if you have something with heaps of clove in it? Mint, or actually more specifically kind of halfway between mint and eucalyptus. Bubblegum, straight up, classic, old school bubblegum. Dill, kind of like the leftover brine from dill pickles. Black licorice, and to a lesser degree, aniseed. Not all ryes will have all of those tasting notes, and obviously those tasting notes can show up in whiskies that don't have rye, but it kind of gives you a general idea, in my opinion, of what rye can do to a whiskey. If you like those sort of things, you might just dig some rye. So now we need to get this thing back down to 25 degrees Celsius, which for me is going to be pitching temperature for my yeast. I am going to be using half Angel whiskey yeast and half Angel English ale yeast. I've been finding that combination is quite tasty. The easiest way to get this down to temperature is just to let it sit. But when I finally got this down to pitching temperature, there was already some action happening in it. Some of the wild yeast, fungi, something in the grain, I'm assuming, had started to grow and take off. It wasn't horrible, it was subtle, but there was definitely a slight smell of blue cheese to it all. If you want to avoid that situation, you can use something like this. This is a wort chiller. Essentially, you just hang it over the side into your fermenter, plug a garden hose into one end with an exhaust on the other. It cycles cold water through, and it's a great little heat transfer. But anyway, it wasn't a huge deal. I got a big double pitch of yeast into the fermenter ASAP, which managed to take off and outcompete, at least while the yeast was actively fermenting, pretty easily still. It fermented for 5 days, and then I let it settle out for 1 day. I did, however, make sure to get this thing into the still ASAP, because whatever was growing in there beforehand was probably going to carry on growing after the yeast tapered off. Fermentation is over. It is time for distillation. Now, if you have a still that can distill on the grain, you're going to find this to be redundant for you. For example, I have the Genio. I could distill in a Genio, but that would make it too easy, and it's not exactly representative of what most home distillers are going to be able to do. We didn't separate the grain from the liquid during the mashing process, which means it is now time to pay the freaking piper. I'm aiming for 2 stripping runs, and to be fair, the first one is actually going to be pretty easy because we can just skim all the liquid off the top of the ferment. I would suggest using some kind of sieve or, brew in a bag or something just to make sure that you're getting all of those grains and they're not, going into your still. But nevertheless, it's pretty easy. But, this stuff's super freaking thick, right? Is that going to mean it's more likely to puke? For those of you who don't know, puking is simply where it just foams up and up and up, and the foam makes it all the way through the still. Not ideal. I decided to do a wee test before I put this in the still itself, so I grabbed the little air still out, put a couple of litres in, and heated it up until the point where it was boiling, and nothing really happened. It hit hot break, it hot braked, and yeah, I think we're good. So, a little bit of butter in the still just to make sure, a couple of sight glasses on top just to see if something does start puking, and away we go. First stripping run, easy. Second stripping run. Here's the problem, guys. Rye is exactly like everyone says it is. It is super freaking gummy and super freaking sticky. It is hard to show on camera. This is about the best way that I decided I could show it. Especially looking at these images, about all I can say is it's the consistency of KY jelly. Why does that make things hard? Simply because the liquid itself wants to stick to itself and to the grain a whole lot more than a normal liquid would. So when you're trying to squeeze it out, it doesn't want to just be squeezed out of the bag. It's just going to stay there. The most successful way I have found with my equipment to deal with this is to put it all into basically a giant sieve, put a couple of kilos of grain and liquid in there, let it drain for a little bit, and then press it out. This did work, except that normally I can get that pretty much bone dry. With the freaking lube in there, not so much. What I did find worked well was to squeeze out as much as I could and then tip in a small amount, maybe a litre of water, let it sit for 15 minutes, let it drain, and then squeeze it again. That worked a whole lot better, and I was able to get the grain mostly dry. Now, if you don't have a sieve like this, other ways of doing that, going through the same process, would be to use a fruit press with a BIAB bag, use a BIAB bag or a Brew In A Bag and just twist it, like keep twisting it until it puts tension on it and then squeeze it. Or you can use a Brew In A Bag with one of those mop squeezy buckets, that squeezes the mop out for you. Onto the spirit run. And for this, because we had a relatively small amount of low wines, it was only 2 stripping runs, I decided to switch over to the T500. A standard spirit run with a pot still, running relatively low, started at about 45% power, got up to maybe 55-60% power on the T500, but this tasted weird. Pretty much from the get-go, about halfway through the heads, it started tasting like straight up tails. Not quite, but similar, like a funky, super grain, earthy flavor that was almost tails, but not quite. It was bizarre. I literally almost just ran through at full power, collected low wines again, and triple distilled the thing. Like, that's what I thought I was going to have to do. And then right at the point of cutting over to hearts, it cleared up significantly, so I just decided to run with it. After the spirit run and cuts were finished, I proofed it back down to 57% ABV, and I took a wee sample of that to force age. So a small amount went into a jar along with some oak that had been toasted at 220 degrees Celsius in the oven in some tin foil, and then given a sort of medium to heavy char on one side and a light to medium char on the other 2 sides, leaving one just toasted. The sample was then held at 60 degrees Celsius for 3 days. Over those 3 days, it got about an hour and a half of ultrasonic on each day. All right, team, it is time to make a cocktail. See how we've done. So let's make the coffee old-fashioned, shall we? Now, you can find this recipe along with a bunch of other kick-ass recipes on the Mr. Black's YouTube page. But for this one, it is 1 part or 30 mils of Mr. Black's cold brew coffee liqueur and 1 part rye whiskey, plenty of ice, good little stir, and I am going to be using an orange slice today instead of peel, just to piss some people off. So, bullet rye version on this side, my rye version on this side. Let's give them a nudge and see how they're doing. That is really freaking good. Yum. Better overall rye flavor on this one. It's been aged properly. It's not freaking surprising. But the higher proof on this side gives a better overall flavor and balance to the cocktail, in my opinion. This is 55-ish, this is 45. Do we want a dash of bitters? Let's see how that plays. Yeah, I like it with the bitters. Right now, if you put another half part of this in it, so if it was a ratio of 1.5 to 1, I think that would come out on top. But, man, both of these are absolutely freaking delicious. Yeah, that rough, like grainy, earthy thing is coming through a little bit heavy on this, but it does match well with the coffee flavors. You know what, guys? Have you ever had that situation where you think that hot coffee and whiskey is going to work really well together, and then you try it, and more often than not, those combinations just don't quite work? This completely fixes it. Cold brew liqueur and whiskey is freaking amazing. There's a whole host of kind of symbiotic and complementary flavors that go in together. It's really freaking good. So, thank you to Mr. Black for sponsoring this episode. This is actually cold brewed coffee liqueur, not like fake flavorings, and it is damn delicious, guys. It's just vodka, 100% Arabica specialty coffee, and a little bit of sugar to balance things out. The best thing is that you can buy directly from Mr. Black's website in like 14 countries, which is pretty awesome, including USA, UK, and Australia. So head on over to mrblack.co, that's .co, not .com, and use the code STIIILLllll to get 10% off your purchase. Super quick tasting notes on this before we talk about the practicality of making, oh my word, rye at home. I'll be real with you guys, the thing that still shows up the most right up front is that pungent, earthy, rye, grain-like flavor. And it is similar to just actually smelling rye, although this has kind of almost like a sunflower seed quality to it that this flavor doesn't. But if I smell it next to this, which is the version that, you know, didn't go in the ultrasonic, it is vanishing quickly. So I have high hopes that it is just a rough malted rye influenced flavor that is going to take a little bit of time to age out. Did I make the right call exactly on the cuts? I don't know, man. Ask me in a year's time. But what I did think would be fun would be to pull up that list of rye flavors that I've gotten in rye whiskeys before and see if I can find them in here. The earthy thing, 100%. There's too freaking much of it right now. I hope some of it goes away. Cloves and the kind of anesthetic mouthfeel. Yes, definitely. Mint and eucalyptus. I feel like there could be almost the eucalyptus, but I don't know, I might be making that up. I also think that could be something that'll come out more, potentially with a little bit of age. I don't know, we'll see. Bubblegum. No, nada. I don't miss that. Honestly, you can take it. I don't need it. Dill, yes. Out of everything, with exception to the earthiness, that is the strongest flavor I'm getting so far. And aniseed and licorice? No, not really. I think I'd be making it up if I said that. So yes, I think I'm on the right track. Yes, there are rye flavors coming through. I'm happy with that. So just so you know, guys, these are the other two jars that are going to age long term. I'm going to keep this in here for another couple of months and see what happens. I made the mistake of shaking this one up, and I guess there was some ashy stuff sitting on the bottom. A second ago, it looked pretty similar to this. Now it just looks jet black. I guess that needs to settle out again. Anyway, let's get on to talking about the practicalities of doing this at home. But first, I need to say a huge thank you to the Patreons. Thank you so much, Patreons. I really and truly appreciate all of the support you guys give me. I mean, I struggle to come up with ways to say thank you every week, but I really do mean it, team. Thank you. All right, so let me get some of this stuff out of the way. My word, what am I actually going to drink here? Let's, because I'm disgusting, and this is just for me, put that back in there. Put all of that in there. And we can get to know this while we talk. So, if you are one of the few lucky people that can distill on grain at home, I wouldn't stress about this too much. It's not a big deal for you. You ferment on the grain. Maybe you strain some of the liquid and grain out. You put most of the grain into the still, and it's really not a big issue. What about everyone else though? I'll be real with you guys. It is a bit of a pain in the ass. It is hard to work with. It is annoying. Is it a deal breaker? No, totally not. It's not even, I don't know if I'd even call it an extra step. It is just a pain in the ass. It really is. And it's kind of icky and messy. So if you're not into icky and messy, I mean, to be fair, you're probably in the wrong hobby. And I would suggest that unless you are really passionate about rye whiskey, if rye whiskey is the reason you want to start distilling, then I can't really in good faith say, no, don't do an all grain rye as your first all grain. If you're happy to try a bunch of different things out and you're happy to sort of work your way up to something like this, I would suggest your first all grain recipe, number one, make it a single malt. And the reason for that is it can all be malt. Everything has got a diastatic power. You don't have to stress about that. Everything is already gelatinized, so you don't have to worry about that either. It's just a whole lot easier to deal with. Do a single malt first. Then potentially go to a bourbon or a corn-based, whiskey. And then lastly, go to rye. So, team, this is probably quite a long video, but I would love to hear from you. Have you distilled rye? How much of a pain in the ass was it for you? Was it worth the extra effort? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up. That helps me out a bunch. Subscribe down below if you want more content like this popping up in your feed. And I'll catch you next time, guys. Keep on chasing the craft. See ya.